Let's touch grass and chat about why historians cry whenever people lump the pre-contact Americas together as if they were one thing. We've all seen it. A Chinese restaurant with sushi and French fries. A Mexican restaurant with lumpia. A buffet advertising world cuisine that's somehow just pizza, tacos, lo mein, and chicken nuggets. Historians have the exact same reaction when people say the pre-contact Americas. There's a lot more to world cuisine than sad, soggy chicken nuggies, and there was a lot more to the pre-contact Americas than one giant civilization. They were two entire continents filled with hundreds of distinct societies, each with their own governments, economies, religions, and trade networks. Even their own unique systems of forced labor. Boo, slavery. But anyway, if there were hundreds of societies, why does AP World focus on just a handful? Well, simply put, it's because AP World is a survey course. It has to cover almost 1,000 years of the entire globe in a single school year. We get the highlights reel instead of the deep dive, which you'll feel grateful for around the AP exam in May. So instead of trying to teach every civilization in the Americas, it focuses on a few major examples that help us understand the bigger historical patterns. Which means that even though the Blackfoot, Navajo, Cree, Ojibwe, Sioux, Kiowa, and hundreds of other nations are cool and historically significant, they aren't the ones that College Board has singled out. The ones that do make that short list include the Aztec, the Inca, and the Mississippians. Now, this was hundreds of years before High School Musical, so sadly these societies didn't have Zac Efron singing, "We're all in this together," to keep their heads in the game, which is probably for the best. They needed something a bit more tangible and real to keep their empires together. So, how did the Aztec, the Inca, and the Mississippians keep their nations united? Well, the Aztecs were like the world's worst sugar babies. Wait, it makes sense, I swear. And it does have to do with all of the human sacrifice bits. The Aztecs believed their gods required nourishment through human sacrifice, and that continuing these rituals helped preserve the order of the world. And yes, it happened on a much larger scale than most neighboring societies. But the human sacrifice was actually part of a wider trend of demanding tribute from all of their conquered people. Now, where does the sugar baby stuff come in? Well, the Aztecs chose not to directly rule their conquered territories and allowed them to keep their own local rulers. However, the Aztecs still had to keep them in line. So in order to gain maximum benefits while having minimum responsibilities, the Aztecs demanded yearly tributes, or gifts, in the form of cotton, cacao beans, feathers, warriors, and pretty much anything else the empire decided it wanted. If the tributes stopped showing up, the Aztec army did show up, and they weren't exactly known for politely asking a second time. So gifts in exchange for protection, with the constant threat that if the gifts stopped, so did your peaceful existence. Yeah, worst sugar baby ever. So going back to the human sacrifice, religion helped justify conquest. Military victories produced prisoners. Prisoners became sacrifices. Successful wars also produced tribute. Tributes kept the capital incredibly wealthy, which funded even more conquest. Which means that religion, politics, and economics all reinforced each other. Tiny problem. When Hernan Cortés arrived in 1519, many of the neighboring peoples didn't exactly rush to defend the Aztecs. After decades of paying tribute and watching their warriors get captured during the Flower Wars, quite a few communities decided that maybe, just maybe, helping the newcomers overthrow the Aztecs sounded like a pretty good deal. So, turns out that fear can build an empire. It just doesn't always inspire loyalty. Now let's head south to the Andes Mountains and examine how the Incas kept their empire together. Hint, it wasn't fear. Another hint, it certainly wasn't the power of love. Any other guesses? No? It was organization. Ta-da! Not like the Instagram type with 12 jars and a fancy label maker. More like a type A project manager with color-coded calendars and anger problems when things don't go according to schedule. Anyway, the Inca Empire was nearly 3,000 miles long, which, to contextualize this, is basically a road trip from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. Now, your empire's super big. You have no money, no horses, no wheeled transportation, and no written alphabet. So, how does that work? Well, the currency became labor, also known as the mita system. For a set amount of time, each citizen of the empire would engage in public works, such as building roads, bridges, farming, or military service. Every new road made it easier to move armies, supplies, and government officials, which made conquering territory easier, which added more people to the mita system, who built even more roads. Ta-da! Cycle of conquest. Now, it was a bit misleading to say that the Inca didn't have an alphabet, as they did have a method of meticulous record keeping. It's just that they never put ink to paper. They used ropes and knots. These knotted ropes, called quipu, were used to track taxes, labor obligations, and supplies. Those records connected to one of the greatest road systems in world history. Now, the empire was about 3,000 miles long, but within that 3,000 miles, there were about 25,000 miles of roads that crossed mountains, deserts, and valleys. Relay runners carried messages across the empire faster than you might expect. Storehouses filled with food and supplies lined many of those roads, helping armies travel and communities survive difficult years. The Incas basically turned logistics into an art form. But what wasn't artistic was the inheritance system. Most kings in history left everything to their children, but not the Inca. When an emperor died, his successor inherited the title, but not most of the wealth. The previous emperor's family kept managing his estates, almost as if he were still alive, which meant every new emperor had a pretty strong incentive to conquer new land and build new palaces instead of borrowing grandpa's. Weird? Absolutely. Effective? Apparently. The Inca didn't unite people out of fear of the military or human sacrifice like the Aztec. Instead, the Inca united them because the government stitched themselves into nearly every part of daily life, making the idea of revolting inconceivable. Now, zoom back up to further north, all the way to Cahokia. If that means nothing to you, it's located about halfway between Memphis and Chicago, leaning a bit toward the west. It's here that the Mississippians lived. Imagine building one of the largest cities anywhere north of Mexico, with thousands of people, huge ceremonial plazas, massive earthen pyramids. The largest of them all, Monk's Mound, still stands today as a United Nations educational, scientific, and cultural organization site. So simply put, around the year 1200 CE, Cahokia was thriving. Then something happened. No, that's not me trying to build suspense. That's genuinely where the evidence runs out. Seriously, people just started leaving. By the year 1400, Cahokia was largely abandoned, and quite honestly, historians don't know why. I mean, we can make hypotheses and educated guesses, but at this point in time, there's no way to verify them, since there are no written records left explaining what happened. Everything historians know comes from archaeology. This doesn't just mean buildings, it can also mean pottery, graves, plant remains, and even animal bones. That's why you'll often hear historians debate Cahokia. They're not arguing because one side is bad at history. They're arguing because the evidence leaves room for multiple explanations. Like, maybe climate change made farming harder. Or maybe forests were cut down faster than they could regrow. Or maybe disease spread through the crowded city. Or even political problems and factions weakened the government. Or even these problems all flowed together into one dystopian smoothie? Well, even so, one thing is clear. The Mississippians built societies capable of organizing enormous construction projects, maintaining regional trade networks, and supporting large populations centuries before the Europeans arrived. Not bad for a civilization that a lot of people have never heard of. So, TLDR. How did the Aztecs, Inca, and Mississippians hold their societies together? The Aztecs used economic integration through tribute and thriving markets, backed up by military power and religious authority demonstrated through the Flower Wars. The Inca used a labor-based system, aka the Mita system, connected by roads and records, driven by a structural incentive to keep expanding that was baked right into their inheritance law. The Mississippians? We're still finding out. But they built something extraordinary, and the fact that we don't know more about it is a reason to be curious, not a reason to hit skip. Your AP tip of the day is to avoid something called hasty generalization. In plain English, that just means taking one example and pretending it represents everybody. For example, if I told you that pizza is my favorite food, it would be ridiculous to conclude that all history teachers survive exclusively on pizza. Although during grading season, maybe don't rule it out. Anyway, College Board actually likes it when you make broad historical connections. That's one of the hardest skills in AP World. The problem is when your evidence doesn't actually support your conclusion. For example, just because the Aztecs used tributes doesn't mean every civilization in the Americas did. Just because the Inca used the Mita labor system doesn't mean forced labor worked the same way everywhere else. And just because the Mississippians, the Mayans, and the Aztecs built large temples and structures doesn't mean all tribes did. Your job as a historian or a student of history is to notice patterns without pretending every society was identical. Finding patterns while acknowledging the exceptions is a step closer to building complex arguments. So, when you're writing an LEQ or a DBQ, ask yourself, does my evidence actually prove what I'm claiming? Or am I making a hasty generalization? Well, Romeo and I are done with our walk, so before he tries to sneak more grass, we'll be heading home. Peace.